Hello and welcome to the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. And today we're looking at your observations and questions. And please remember to get in touch at X. It's at ponsonbymassie, or you can email us at ponsonbymassie@gmail.com. That's ponsonbymassie@gmail.com. Just running through one or two of your comments. The first one, Darren McGarvey. Now, you'll know Darren as Loki. He's an author, a presenter, and social activist. And he says, I'm using this podcast almost exclusively to follow the general election campaign as I can no longer tolerate the news. Thanks very much, Darren, for the thumbs up. I suppose a lot of people do look at social media platforms, Alex, because let's face it, during the course of a general election campaign, the news reports are all sterile because they have to be.
Well, certainly on television. I mean, the newspapers, Bernard, obviously continue to do a thorough job of covering the campaign. Some papers more respectably than others. Little shout out to my colleagues at the Times and the Sunday Times here. Fine people working for a fine paper. But yes, I mean, I think one of the difficulties for an election campaign, particularly a long election campaign like this one, which is 6 weeks in its formal part, but is also in some ways 6 months in terms of the lead up to it, is that there is so much coverage that it can be quite overwhelming, and you wonder, do I have to pay attention to all of it? And the obvious answer to that is that no, you don't. But we're very grateful to all of you who are listening to us. I think we've had more than 20,000 downloads in the last couple of weeks, which is a very gratifying number. We're very grateful to your support and for listening to us and for watching us on YouTube and Facebook. Politics, I mean, this is one of the things I think that Keir Starmer gets when he talks about wanting politics to tread a little more lightly in people's lives. What he means by that is that it shouldn't be a sort of constant psychodrama of the sort that we've endured for many years now, both in terms of Brexit and Boris and COVID and so on at a UK level, the constitutional question in Scotland for a decade. I think that has been a draining, energy-sapping experience for an awful lot of voters. And so Keir Starmer's call for what Warren Harding, the American president, said in 1920, a return to normalcy, a return to normality in British terms, has a significant appeal. It actually gets into something that a lot of voters are yearning for, which is not necessarily a non-interventionist government, but a government that they don't have to be thinking about all the time, that they don't have to have a reaction to everything the government is doing. And I think that is one of the things that Starmer understands and explains some of his success in this campaign, I think.
Okay, I mean, I get Darren's point. As somebody who worked for very many years in television, I can tell you that during the course of an election campaign, the production assistants sit with a stopwatch to make sure that all of the parties get broadly equal time. There is a tendency simply to report what they say. Yes, there'll be a little bit of fact-checking and a sense in which people will play devil's advocates in interviews with politicians, but this is what is called in broadcast terms, certainly, a regulated period. And during the regulated period, the normal injunctions about impartiality and neutrality, well, they're completely and utterly hardwired. And that's why I say that sometimes the reportage is a little bit sterile, because very often some broadcasters, not all of them, but some broadcasters come at elections from the point of view, let's not get complaints and let's not offend. And there is a view that says that in journalism, if you're not making a nuisance of yourself, you're not really doing your job. So I absolutely get the observation that Darren is making. Question from Rob Shorthouse. Now, Rob Shorthouse used to be an advisor to the former First Minister Jack McConnell, was also a spin doctor for the Better Together campaign during the referendum. And his question is, does Labour actually need a constitutional offer for the Holyrood election in 2026? Rob's own view is that it doesn't. My view is that they do, and we'll come back to that a bit later. Alex, what's your view?
I don't think they do at all either. I think arguments over constitutional boundaries, over devolved powers for Holyrood are not where the electorate is right now. I think there are various common sense areas where you could devolve additional responsibilities, but I don't think there is any great demand for it. I think that, however, that the professional media class in Scotland is going to spend about 2 years talking about this, which is fundamentally a process question rather than a policy one. And the SNP are obviously going to be talking about this a lot. I think the worthy voices in the Scottish commentariat, of which there is no shortage, the people who view themselves as, if you like, the godfathers and protectors and guarantors of devolution, will spend a lot of time talking about Labour's requirement to have a constitutional offer. I don't think it's where voters are right now. I think what voters want is a politics that actually works and delivers, and I'm not sure that they really care about constitutional proprieties and boundaries in that respect. And so I think this is a matter that is of considerable interest to the professional political class, but has very little purchase for the vast majority of voters in Scotland.
Well, I disagree with that for a very, very simple reason. Anyone that thinks that the constitutional question has gone away and gone away for a long time, I think is deluding themselves. Support for Scottish independence is still pretty high. And what the election is likely to point out is that there's a massive gap between support for the SNP and support for independence. Now, there's a question in the run-up to 2026 about whether or not that will be filled by more votes for the Greens, or perhaps Alex Salmond can engineer a bit of insurgency around Alapa. But Donald Dewar was, in my view, entirely correct that devolution is a process and it's not an event. And the problem for Labour, if they simply say the constitutional question has been put back in its box, support for the SNP has failed, we can now breathe a collective sigh of relief and not talk about the governance of the country for a very, very long time, then they could end up paying a price. Labour have tended to do well, and this was the experience of, the Gascaden by-election in 78, which stopped 70s nationalism stone dead, going into the Constitutional Convention. When they're being seen to debate and think seriously about powers and where power should lie and where the Scottish Parliament should go, when they're ahead of the curve on the constitutional question, when they help dictate the narrative, they do well. When they say nothing or take a perpetual oppositionist position, I think they tend to do badly. If Labour are wise, they should get the thinking hats on.
Well, because again, it is a question that one could do a whole show on, and I suspect that our producer Paul is going to have to be cutting a fair bit of this just now. I would just say that any changes that Labour makes and so on should be for the better delivery of policy outcomes, not made because they think that doing this will satisfy the nationalist demand for independence, because it doesn't work like that. You could devolve and devolve and devolve and devolve without satisfying the SNP's demand for independence. And I think it would be a mistake for pro-UK, for unionist parties to take the view that the SNP can somehow be bought off, or that support for independence can be bought off and pacified by the devolution of further responsibilities. That doesn't mean you don't have to devolve certain things, employment law or immigration aspects of immigration are obvious contenders, but that should be specifically because it can be hoped to lead to better policy outcomes, not better political outcomes.
Absolutely, and you've given two great examples. Immigration, to grow the Scottish economy, there should be devolution of that issue. Employment law, Labour seemed to be going down that route a couple of years ago. They are not. You don't devolve for the sake of devolving. You devolve because it makes sense, improves government, and it helps you deliver policy outcomes. So on that point, we will agree. John Duffy says, don't think we used this one last time. The summary of his question is, who do you think is likely to lose a seat, who will be a great loss of talent to the SNP, or indeed a loss of talent to any of the other parties?
Well, that's an excellent question, because there are always, regardless of what one's own political preferences may be, there are always people in other parties who you think, well, they're a good MP and their loss would be significant. I think somebody like Joanna Cherry is going to win in Edinburgh South West, but were she to lose, I think that would be a grave misfortune. It would be sad news for the media, certainly, because Joanna Cherry has the potential to be a sort of one-woman awkward squad amongst the SNP delegation at Westminster, and the press is temperamentally and prejudice in favour of awkward squads. But I think she has interesting things and important things to say on a number of issues, and she would be a loss. I think Stuart MacDonald in Glasgow South would also be a loss. Formerly the SNP's defence spokesman. He's done a lot of work, I think, to help the SNP adopt a more realistic and, frankly, a morally serious defence and foreign policy posture. And I think that's a voice that is overdue in nationalist circles, where the SNP has often not been very good on foreign policy questions and has downplayed the importance of security. Well, that's no longer possible, I think, in the Europe of 2024. And so I think he would be a loss. And I think there are various other SNP candidates who are standing, who are not in Parliament at the moment, but who would improve Parliament. I think Stephen Gethins in Arbroath and Brodie Ferry, I think, would be another good voice, particularly, again, on international issues for the SNP. So, I can't think of many Conservative MPs who are likely to lose and so on, who would be a great loss. But, and the same with the Liberal Democrats. I don't know. I mean, what's your views on this, Bernard? What's your answer to this question?
I actually don't disagree with anything you've said. Joanna Cherry would be a loss. And let's be clear, we are not saying that these people are going to lose before people start saying, there they go, predicting the demise of the SNP. This is just for the purposes of the discussion. I don't know Joanna Cherry particularly well. I think I've said hello to her on a couple of occasions. I thought it was incomprehensible when she was removed from the front bench by Ian Blackford, because whatever you think of her position on strategies for independence or her issues on women's rights, she was an effective spokesperson for her party. Stuart MacDonald, I certainly do know, and know, I think, reasonably well. And he is prepared to think out the box and to court unpopularity within his own party in arguing for something which he believes to be right. And what we need in politics, in my view, is more people arguing their own mind rather than bowing the knee to groupthink. So I certainly agree with most of those comments. Colin Thompson in Canada asks, do Bernard and Alex have a recommendation for a book on Scottish politics from 1999 to the present? And that's from an outsider, he says, he wants to better understand the personalities of the different parties. There's not a lot of books out there. There's one or two from journalists and several more that are sort of more weighty academic tones. There's nothing that jumps out to me which is immediately accessible, Alex.
No, I mean, one of the problems that we have in Scottish politics is that this is a very small world, and the market for books about Scottish politics is consequently very small too. So there isn't a lot of money in it for authors or, importantly, for publishers. And so this then has an impact on people's willingness to write the kind of comprehensive history of the last 25 years that we're being asked about. I mean, I think the useful starting place is on the referendum in 2014. Ian McWhirter's book on the referendum is a good one. Joe Pike's book on the Better Together campaign is a good one. I think a very revealing one about how that campaign ran and how it saw the job of putting a pro-UK message in a nationalist era. I think it grapples with that very well. The best book on the recent SNP difficulties, I think, is Breakup by Kieran Andrews and David Clegg, looking at the Alex Salmond affair and the dissolution of his relationship with Nicola Sturgeon, which is in some ways the font and origin of the SNP's current difficulties. actually. I think a lot of things trace back to that, and that's it's not a comprehensive political history of Scottish politics in recent years, but it is the best available guide to that drama, which, as I say, the consequences of which continue to play out. But there isn't that great book, that one book that explains it all. No.
Just to Colin, if you're looking for something maybe a little bit more academic, then you could maybe type into Google Professor James Mitchell, who tends to come at a lot of these questions in a more academic sense, and he co-authored a book, The Scottish Parliament at 20 years of the Scottish Parliament. An absolutely fantastic first chapter in that book, summarising the first 20 years by a chap called Bernard Ponsonby. But you might also want to... you also might want to Google David Torrance, who's written many books, one on Alex Salmond, which Alex Salmond doesn't like, one on Nicola Sturgeon. He's also written one on the Scottish Secretaries, the Office of Secretary of State for Scotland. What you will not find, alas, Colin, is the late, great Janie Buchan, who was a member of the European Parliament, represented Glasgow for the Labour Party, who did not get round to publishing her autobiography. She used to say to me regularly, "He's in my autobiography, you know. It's called Shits I Have Known." Unfortunately, we never did get to read Shits I Have Known. Right.
That might have been the longest. That might have been the longest book about Scottish politics ever written.
Well, she did actually say to me once, she said, "He's in my book, Shits I Have Known." She said, "I've got 300 pages written and I'm still only 25. Right, we're going to take one who styles himself Argyll Loon. And this is in relation to the podcast that we did with the irrepressible Dorothy Grace Elder. But Argyll Loon is not impressed because he says, "Geez, what a bitter person Dorothy Grace Elder is. The young team who were teenagers when she was sharing an office with Alec Neil will bring us forward. Give them a platform." But Ewen Kennedy said, the highlight of today was listening to the podcast. Dorothy Grace doesn't exactly aim to miss, and we'd be stupid to ignore the message from someone who was there with John Swinney first time around. Well, to Argyll Loon, I'm going to say to you, and we've made this point once or twice, when the election is over, we are in the market for new voices. We want to hear from new voices, and if those voices are worth an airing, we will have you on. So remember to get in touch, ponsonbymassie@gmail.com, and on X it is ponsonbymassie.
Yes, and also delighted to say that quite a number of school pupils have been listening. I know at George Watson's College, the Modern Studies S2 classes have been listening to the podcast with a view to seeing what they could learn as they try and make a podcast themselves, which raises the appalling possibility that we're going to be shown up by a bunch of 13-year-olds, Bernard. But we're very grateful to have them listening. Also, pupils at Skegness Grammar School and Rawlins Academy in Leicestershire, whose political science teachers have told us that their pupils have been listening to the podcast and learning about the Scottish element of the campaign and some of the polling explanations that we had with Professor Ailsa Henderson from Edinburgh University. So that just goes to show the reach of the podcast is already extraordinary, all the way to Skegness.
Yeah. And thanks to the observations from Thomas House, who is Professor of Mathematical Science at the University of Manchester, and Martin Shaw, Sussex University, who got in touch to make one or two observations on that podcast that we did with Professor Ailsa Henderson. I think that was our second podcast on the whole business of polling and MRP. This is probably something that we will come back to post-election, because one of the interesting questions is whether or not this new sort of methodology actually stands up when we actually see the final result. Anything else which has caught your eye, Alex, in terms of folk writing in?
Yes, well, an excellent question from Paul, who notes that, you know, over a series of podcasts, we've sort of suggested that all kinds of small factors, you know, whether it's, you know, gambling on the election date or J.K. Rowling having a go at Keir Starmer and the Labour Party, stamps and the possible misuse of them by SNP staffers in the Scottish Parliament. So nothing seems to change voters for you. So Paul says, you know, are you two living in ivory towers? He suggests, wondering if we're dismissing the cumulative impact of small matters, you know, accepting that you know, no individual straw breaks a camel's back, perhaps, but collectively they can. You know, that are we downplaying all the news actually?
No, I don't think we are, because if any of these issues were fundamentally gaining any traction, then the polls would be moving. And, you know, the polls were fairly consistent before the calling of the election. The polls are perfectly consistent since the election's been called. Labour are still enjoying an average lead of about 20 points. And if nothing is moving, and people ask us questions, will this move the dial? Will that move the dial? Well, the evidence is that nothing is moving the dial. So I suppose that the analysis has to be rather obvious if it's rather dull. On the issue of ivory towers, I must live therefore in the most expensive ivory tower in the East End of Glasgow. In fact, if there was an ivory tower at the East End of Glasgow, it wouldn't be standing particularly.
It would have been sacked and pillaged.
It certainly would. And ivory towers, well, you know, not many ivory towers, but those who float through the merchant city in Glasgow and the town, they will tell you that I prop up many a bar and many a day, but none of them are in ivory towers. You would have to go to sort of places like Kilmarnock for that. That's a dig at the producer, by the way.
But it is a reasonable point, though. You know, at what point do political views sort of crystallize and shift? And I think one of the things that that political scientists often stress is that it's, you know, the day-to-day events during a campaign can have an impact, but they generally only rarely do, because what really matters are underlying fundamental questions, which are connected to, you know, the sense of competence, the growth of the economy, a whole range of other issues that are the building blocks, if you like, or the foundations upon which everything else takes place in a campaign. And so what tends to happen in campaigns is that people think, well, I'm ready for a change of government, and so they then grasp, you know, take hold of any evidence that seems to support that. Or conversely, they say, well, I don't trust the opposition. I don't think they're good enough to replace the current lot. I may not like the current lot very much, but the opposition haven't done the job of demonstrating they're ready for government themselves. And so people find evidence to confirm that view during an election campaign, which is why election debates, and there's another one between Starmer and Sunak on Wednesday night, tend not to move the needle or the dial very much at all, because people take what they want to take from these things. Against that, there are events, I think, which underlie or confirm people's views more generally, and so on. So I think, you know, Rishi Sunak's D-Day problem in this campaign didn't persuade people who were previously going to vote Conservative that they should abandon the Tories, but did tell a lot of people that, yeah, damn it, I'm right to have abandoned the Tories. I'm right to have had enough of them. You know, I'm fed up with them. They can't do anything right. It's time to clear them out and replace them with another lot, and we'll deal with the disappointments that come with a new government in their own course. But, you know, at the moment, change is more important than anything else. And so the difficulty for the Conservatives in this campaign has been that they have failed to find anything to, if you like, derail the change express.
Absolutely. A big thanks to Andy Leighton, who has also written in, and to Kathleen Thorburn. And this was one on Twitter. We'll read it out because it's nice and it's kind, and we're in the market for people being nice and kind about the podcast. Thanks for these podcasts. Fantastic to be able to listen to some in-depth, intelligent analysis of Scottish politics, says Luca Brasi, who of course was a character in The Godfather.
Well, I mean, that salmon I sent Mr. Brasi and so on is money well spent, clearly. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that contribution to the discourse.
Right. And just to make the point once again, there was a sense in which we were going to launch this podcast, and the idea was that there would be an election in November, and we would launch it a couple of months before the election. We were slightly sort of caught in the hop. So we are, in a sense, sort of making this up as we go along. But we're very, very clear about what we want to do with the podcast longer term. And what we want to do with it is to hear from new voices. So we do actually read all of these emails that come in, and we do actually look at what people are saying, and we are in the market for individuals who are not quoted in the mainstream media, who are not quoted in newspapers, but who have something interesting to say. And really the one thing we want to do with the podcast longer term is to have people say interesting things that we can throw out there, which will help inform the public discourse, hopefully make it a little bit less angry, hopefully make it a little bit more growing up. And we know that there are folk out there who think I am biased and that I am doing the work of one political party or one side of the constitutional question. There are people that will take that view of Alex as well. I would simply say, stick with this, give us a chance. Let's see where we are later on in the year. Hold us to what we want to do, which is to bring in new voices, different voices, to have a better informed political discourse. But do stay with us. Isn't that right, Alec?
Well, not just stay with us, but encourage your friends and family and even your foes to listen to the podcast too, because it is greatly enhanced by the feedback we get from listeners. We're very grateful to you. We're also very grateful to those businesses who've been in touch, expressing interest in perhaps sponsoring and supporting the podcast. And we'd love to hear from other businesses that might be interested in doing that too. Again, the email address is ponsonbymassie@gmail.com, and it's ponsonbymassie on Twitter. We're very grateful to have you all with us, and we look forward to engaging with you in the weeks and months and years ahead. But thank you very much for being with us.